Where's God?
He's not on your screen.
Is the current theme here at Grace Church for, I think when we started it was going to be a few weeks, but it looks like it's going to be at least all of this year. And my role in this current theme of Where's God is to take one of the epistles, one of the letters from the New Testament, and unpack that a little bit for you. So that each time I preach this year, that's what I'm doing. And we're up to the second and third letters of John. And you can see there's a bit of a theme there of truth, love, and hospitality. This is a graphic that shows you the length of all the books in the New Testament based on a number of verses. And the length of the triangle going across the page is the length of that book based on a number of verses. So the red ones are the Gospels, the stories about Jesus. The orange one is the story about the early church. Yellow is Paul's letters to the churches. Green is Paul's letters to individuals. Blue is other general letters by other people to other churches and people. And purple is the end time book and prophecy of Revelation. Just a quick random reminder, which has nothing to do with the rest of today, that Luke and Acts were written by the same person. So it's good to read those two with that in mind. This is what we've covered so far. Those books, and this is what we are doing today. 2nd and 3rd John. And John, sometimes a little bit hard with some of these books to know exactly who wrote them and when they were written, because it was all happening about 2,000 years ago. But the conventional thought is that John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, wrote these particular books that are highlighted there. So the Gospel of John about Jesus, and 1, 2 and 3 John, all written by the same author. So a little bit of revision from 1 John, just to set the scene a little bit and to remind you about that book, which we did a little while ago. Why was John writing 1 John? He wrote to make sure that the recipient's joy was complete. He wrote to them so they wouldn't sin, but they'd have victorious Christian lives. He wrote to them so they were aware of false teachers, to discern false from truth. And he wrote to give them an assurance of eternal life, to know that, or what you have, to know the truth. There's a big theme in 1 John about knowing the truth. So the themes there we looked at last time for 1 John were life, fellowship and abiding, and knowing. So that brings us to 2nd and 3rd John. You haven't gone fast through these slides. Yeah. You must be looking forward to this, because it's almost coffee time. I'm about halfway through already. So, I've mentioned who John was. So John who? John is the disciple whom Jesus loved. It was written in the late 1st century. So there's a bit of debate about it, but maybe about 60 years after Jesus died on the cross and came back to life was when these books were written. These are the shortest books in the New Testament. So 2 John is, or 2nd John is the shortest book based on a number of verses. 3rd John is the shortest book based on the number of words in the original Greek language. So these are the 2 shortest books in the Bible, in the New Testament. There are clear themes and purposes in these 2 books. They were written to different recipients, but they're probably widely read and circulated in that time. And there's a common structure between the 2. There'll be a short delay. I can't pick up my page. And the common structure looks like this. Both books start off with, this letter is from John, the elder. And soon after that, John says who he's writing to. So in 2 John, he's writing to the chosen lady and to her children, whom I love in the truth. A little bit of debate about who the chosen lady was, but the most likely scenario, and the one that I believe, is that it's code for the church, because there was persecution at the church at that time. So it was a code to say this letter is going to a particular church, and her children were the people in the church. In 3 John, he's writing to a friend called Gaius. So he says, my dear friend whom I love in the truth. And then in both books it goes through what the book's all about and what the letter's all about. And then towards the end he says exactly the same thing. I have much more to say to you, but I don't want to do it with paper and ink, for I hope to visit you soon and talk with you face to face. So that brings us to the middle, what really happens in 2 John or 2 John. John writes to a church, the chosen lady, with a message to live according to the truth and to love one another. He talks about not being deceived and not wandering away from the truth that they know. So this little graphic, I know the word's a little bit too hard for you to read, but the point is that I've highlighted the 3 most common words in 2 John. The green highlights are the word love. The yellow ones are truth, and the purple ones are live. So love, truth, and live are really the themes and the recurring thoughts in this book of 2 John. Verse 5 says the reason he's writing. I'm writing to remind you to love one another. This is the key message. So this brings us to this slide here, which talks about the purposes, the key purposes of 2 John. Reminder to love one another. And I want to pause there to remind you to love one another.
Okay, I'll give you a hug.
So, have a look around at the weirdos in the church. And did I look at you when I said that?
There you go.
To love one another. Think about, like he's writing to a church, the chosen lady, so he's talking about relationships in the church. But we could extend that beyond relationships within the church as well. To love one another, to love people. So close your eyes for a moment and just think about some people in your world and think about loving them, doing what you can do to make their life better, to bless them, to help them, to encourage them, to inspire them, to love one another. You can open your eyes again. The other purposes are, it's too small on here to read, so I'll just swing around here. There are deceivers. Some deny Jesus came in a real body, John writes to the church. So remain diligent and do not wander away. So we need to be alert, we need to be on guard for apparent truths, deceptions that might lead us away from the truth about Jesus. And there is so much of that that we could get sucked into. If you look online and Google a few things, you're likely to find a lot of deceptions and a lot of lies. So we need to be on guard. We need to know the truth, which is from 1 John, knowing the truth about God and remaining diligent about that. And the other purpose that John writes is about not encouraging people who are engaged in doing evil. We're going to talk a little bit about encouraging those and blessing those who are doing good. But for someone who's doing evil, don't encourage them in that evil. So one verse contains all 3 of the most repeated words of love, truth, and live. And it is that verse on the screen there. Grace, mercy, and peace, which come from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, will continue to be with us who live in truth and love. And I think that's a great encouragement and perhaps a challenge to us today to live in truth and love. To know the truth, to not be deceived from wandering away from the truth, and to love one another. So to live in truth and love. That's 2 John. 3 John. In 3 John he writes to Gaius, his friend. And Gaius he wasn't a church leader, he was a layperson. And he had some wealth and distinction where he lived near Ephesus. And so he encourages Gaius with this letter, calls him over and over again his friend. And friend is really a theme in this book. So the three words, or the third one I think is two words, that are repeated over and over again are friend, truth, and travelling teachers. Now that's a bit weird, isn't it? Friend, truth, and travelling teachers. In this book, there is no mention of Jesus. And it's particularly unusual to have a book in the New Testament that doesn't mention Jesus. It talks a bit about God, but there's no mention specifically of Jesus. So, on the screen, friend, the word friend is purple, the word truth is yellow, and travelling teachers and teachers is green. So, the purposes. Why did he write 3 John? Why did he write to his friend Gaius? He wanted to thank Gaius for caring for travelling teachers. So those people were travelling around and doing good work, and Gaius was taking care of them, providing for their needs and sending them on their way, on their journey to do more good in other places. John writes to warn Gaius about a guy called Diotrephes, who was causing instability in the church and speaking untruths and being deceptive and refusing to engage with the leadership of the church. So he sends this warning to Gaius about this guy called Diotrephes. And in the midst of that, he encourages Gaius, and remember this letter would have been read by lots of people, not just Gaius, but he encourages his readers to follow good examples. Not to follow bad examples, but to follow good examples. So the key verses here are, the first one is, so we ourselves should support them, this is the travelling teachers, so that we can be their partners as they teach the truth. And there are a lot of good things going on in the Christian world. There are a lot of good ministries, lots of wonderful things happening, and the vast majority of them don't have a consistent supply of resource without people being generous and supporting them. That's kind of the way it works. So for me personally, in some of the chaplaincy roles that I have, I am so thankful for friends and family and people who are in this church, even people who are here today, who have given financially to the work that we do. Because if we didn't have that resource, it would be very hard to continue. So this is what he's talking about, supporting people who are travelling teachers and doing good work. So I know we're a generous church. I know that to a large degree we're already doing that. But I want to encourage you that if you have the resource to increase that, or at least to continue that, then keep doing that. That's the way it works. We give to people who are doing good work so that they can continue to do the good works. The second one, dear friends, don't let this bad example influence you. Follow only what is good. So the bad example, so John writes this section of the letter about Diotrephes and says that he is bad news. And then, just after that, he speaks about a guy called Demetrius and says that Demetrius is a good guy. And in between the negative example and the positive example, he puts this verse. He says, dear friend, don't let this bad example influence you, follow only what is good. And then he goes on to talk about Demetrius. That's the good one. Follow the example of Demetrius. So that is important for us, that we follow good examples. We are influenced by the people that we spend time with, by the people that we watch online, by the people that we read, by the podcasts we listen to. All sorts of people influence us. So we need to choose good examples and not bad examples to follow. There's another verse I wanted to mention as well. And that is, this is from the NIV. And the words there are to say, you would do well to send them on in a manner worthy of God. And I have preached on this concept before. I can't remember when that was, maybe last year or the year before. Pastor Dermot would know. He memorises all my messages. Send them on in a manner worthy of God. And I love that concept. And as a chaplain, that's pretty much what I do. Regardless of who I'm talking to, and regardless of what situation they're in, who they are, what their belief system is, and all sorts of things about that person are not relevant to me in showing care.
Yeah.
I don't judge based on their colour of their skin or their religion or their sexuality or anything. I send them on in a manner worthy of God. And I think that's an important way for us to treat the people in our world. And Pastor Derwin was talking earlier about the fact that we're all humans. And there's a deeper level of who we are than our religion or the colour of our skin or our gender. And that is that we are created in the image of God.
Yeah.
We're human beings created in the image of God. So as an airport chaplain, for example, I am at the airport to offer emotional and spiritual care to people of any faith or no faith. Although, yes, we are Christians who are serving in that role, we're not there just for the Christians. We're there to serve people.
Yes.
People who are created in the image of God. So, speaking of airport chaplaincy, Pastor Devon mentioned I was in London recently and travelling with our eldest son. There he is. I was looking around, scanning the crowd. Speaking of sons, I've got to mention that we've reached a milestone in our family in that our youngest is now an adult, turned 18 this year. So, I now no longer have, congratulations. I now no longer have childish children. I've only got
You have childish adults now.
How good is that? Now, for those who have been there before, is it a good stage of life?
Took him a
It's
while.
an overwhelming response, but is it a bad stage of life? No. Good. So, I attended the conference, annual conference of the International Association of Civil Aviation Chaplains. And I think it was the 54th annual conference, so it's been going for a little while. And the topics that we covered were wide and varied. And of course, we talked a lot about how chaplaincy works in airports. And it's a little bit embarrassing when you come from such a small airport, as Hobart Airport, and people at Heathrow and DFW in the US and other places where they've got so many flights per day and multiple runways and multiple terminals and millions of passengers going through there. It's just a different world. But it was all very interesting and inspiring. And some of the topics that presenters spoke about were on the future of aviation, embracing change, the fight against human trafficking, well-being and adversity, and working with differences. And we also had a tour of the British Airways training facility where they train their pilots and cabin crew. And that was a fantastic experience to see what happens and what the cabin crew, for example, have to go through with their training. But also to see the A380 flight simulators, which cost somewhere between 12 and 14 million pounds each. And there's 12 of them lined up in a row in this massive big warehouse. And they get used from about 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day by pilots doing their training, but also doing part of their accreditation and compliance work. I think they have to go back there every 6 months and go through some kind of course, and then the pilots can book an hour or two a session in the simulator to practice something if they want to. So it was quite an amazing thing to see all that. So that was the conference, but we were also there, Jay and I were there at a very historic time with the death of the Queen just before we arrived. And it was amazing to be in London at that time. I know we all experienced that to some degree in Australia, and she died a week or so before we left, so I understand a little bit about what it was like here, but it was amazing to be in London at that time. So Jay and I went to Hyde Park, where they had about 8 massive screens set up and tens of thousands of people watching the funeral on the big screens. And it was quite incredible to be a part of a crowd that large that stood up to sing God Save the King when, for all of my lifetime and more, it's always been God Save the Queen. And to see the respect for the royal family and to be a part of that crowd at that time was just amazing. So we left Hyde Park and went to a place where the hearse was going to drive past, which is what that photo is. If you look closer, you can see the hearse and the coffin of the Queen. And surprisingly, Jay's photos are so much better than mine. And I grew in a crowd of people, and you can see how far we were from the road where she drove. Well, not she wasn't driving. Where the hearse was driven past. And I'm here, and Jay's right next to me. And we're about the same height. I'm still taller, but we're about the same height. And his photos are so much better. I think, what did I do wrong? But anyway, that's my photo. That's what you get from me.
That's not bad.
It's not too bad.
That's good.
Yeah. Proves we were there. Being part of the action.
It's got to sign my photos.
The Queen gave a brilliant example over 7 decades. And we were talking before about good examples and bad examples. And she was just an amazing example of a lady of influence and stability on the world stage for all those decades, and never shied away from being public about her Christian faith. And it was obviously an amazing life that she lived. And one thing about her was that she was welcoming and inclusive. And I spoke before about that as airport chaplains, we don't need to find out someone's faith before we help them. We just help people. And she was a bit like that. She was very welcoming. And one of the speakers at the International Association of Civil Aviation Chaplains is a multi-faith organisation. So as you can imagine, there are lots of airports where there's, for example, lots of Muslims, and they have Muslim prayer rooms and chapels for the Christians and Muslim prayer rooms for the Muslims, etc. And so it's a multi-faith organisation. And one of the speakers was a Muslim chaplain he spoke at a session which was about chaplaincy in other spheres, to inspire the airport chaplain. So he's actually a hospital chaplain, and he leads a chaplaincy in a large hospital in the UK. And his name is Yunus Dudwala. And he spoke, as you can imagine, everyone spoke about the Queen, because that was the topic of the day, and you couldn't really avoid it. And he spoke about how welcoming the Queen was to the Muslim community in England. And there's been mosques in London for a long time before the Queen came on the scene, but the Muslim population really exploded in the 1950s and 1960s. But the Queen was the first monarch to visit a mosque, and that was in 2002, which was 1 year after 9/11, when there was a lot of world leaders who were saying negative things about the Muslim faith. And so this guy was talking about how welcoming and inclusive she was. And I want to make a point that she never shied away from her Christian faith. She didn't take an interfaith, multi-faith stance and say all roads lead to Rome. She was very strong that Christianity was the way to go and Jesus is the way, the truth and the life. But she didn't shy away from engaging with people of other faith. So a couple of things she said over her years were these. Christ not only revealed to us the truth in his teachings, he lived by what he believed and gave us the strength to try to do the same. And finally, on the cross, he showed the supreme example of physical and moral courage. We may hold different points of view, but it is in times of stress and difficulty that we most need to remember that we have much more in common than there is dividing us. And this strikes to the heart of that concept I spoke of before, where we're human beings. Yes, we have these different faiths and these different things layered on top, but we're human beings created in the image of God. Now I need to ask what the time is.
10:57.
Thank you. No prizes, unfortunately. So, now's the time to be controversial, perhaps. What the Essendon Football Club doesn't seem to understand is that Christians can disagree with someone but still love them and respect them and include them the same way they would someone they did agree with. As I said before, chaplains show emotional or provide emotional and spiritual care to those of any faith or none. So if there are any Essendon supporters out there today, it's time now to transfer from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light.
The Lions.
Carlton.
The Lions, come on.
So what should our response be to all of this morning? From 2 John, from 2 John, we need to acknowledge God's truth and love, because they dwell within us. We receive the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus within us, and we therefore have God's truth and love living within. Now I've picked 3 points out of each of the 2 books this morning to get you thinking about possible responses, but the reality is there might be other things that came to mind for you as we look through these 2 books. And to be honest, the next couple of minutes are the most important couple of minutes of this sermon time, if you like. Because this is where you get to respond. What's your response to the Word of God today? So the first one, acknowledge God's truth and love living within. Don't be deceived, stick to the truth. And maybe there's some pathway you've been going down which you perhaps shouldn't be. Or you're having second thoughts about it and thinking, maybe that's not right. Maybe I shouldn't be thinking that way or going that way with my thinking. Keep loving one another. That is a key message. Keep loving one another. And from 3 John, walk in the truth. Practice hospitality. Send them on in a manner worthy of God. And follow good examples. Follow good examples. And I think one extension of that one is to be a good example. Can you be a good example to people who perhaps look up to you, or people that you influence? It could be in a workplace, could be in a school, could be here at the church, it could be in your family, it could be in your street, in your neighbourhood, in a community organisation, a sporting club. All sorts of places that we can be a good example. So as the band comes, please, let's close our eyes and we'll pray.